Vivek Murthy, Surgeon General. Thank you so much for talking with me. Dr. Murthy, I know that we've had conversations about loneliness before. In fact, I think we first broached the topic, 5 or 6 years ago. And I'm curious if the loneliness epidemic has gotten better or worse.
Well, I'm so glad you asked, and please call me Vivek, Katie. I know we've known each other a while. I worry that the loneliness epidemic has gotten worse over the last few years, and in particular because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that added fuel to a fire that was already burning long before COVID. But unfortunately, what we are seeing, and I see this firsthand when I travel across the country, is that there's so many people who are struggling with a sense of isolation and separation from others, who went through what really can be described as trauma during the pandemic, where they lost loved ones and were separated from loved ones during periods of extreme stress, and they're still recovering from that. So one of the reasons I am issuing a Surgeon General's advisory on loneliness and isolation for the first time is I believe it's even more urgent than ever for us to let the entire country know how common loneliness is, with nearly 1 in 2 adults reporting that they're experiencing loneliness, but also how consequential it is for our health. Because now we know that experiencing loneliness and isolation, feelings, being socially disconnected, both impacts our mental health, increasing our risk for depression and anxiety and suicide, but it also impacts our physical health, raising our risk for heart disease, for dementia, and for stroke.
And I know that you have often said being lonely is the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. That sounds hard to believe, but can you explain?
Yeah, so it turns out when you look at the increased risk of premature death from associated with social disconnection, it's on par with what you see with smoking daily, and it's even greater than the mortality impact that we see associated with substance use disorders or with obesity. And if you think about that for a moment, it's staggering, but it's not to say that we should be thinking less about smoking or about obesity, about substance use disorders. It tells you, in fact, that we should be thinking more about loneliness as a public health concern that's also having a powerful impact on our well-being.
In fact, it's the engine for so many of those other issues because often people self-medicate when they're so lonely.
That's right. Loneliness is painful, and I mean that quite literally. It can feel painful, and we know that our brains can often interpret emotional pain as physical pain, which is why sometimes we literally feel it in our body. But when we are in pain as human beings, we seek ways to relieve that pain. Now, if we perhaps reach out to a friend in a moment where we're struggling with loneliness, or get in our car and drive to see a family member, that might be a healthy way of dealing with it. But not everyone always has that option, and sometimes you may find yourself reaching for something that's less healthy to deal with that pain, whether it's alcohol or whether it's other substances. And that can be really problematic, not just for your health and well-being, but for people around you. So this is why it's really important for us to, number one, recognize how common and consequential loneliness, but also to recognize that a lot of people feel ashamed about it. They feel that embarrassed to even admit that they're lonely. And so as common as it is, a lot of times we don't know it. A lot of times we can't tell that other people are struggling with loneliness because it hides in the shadows. And by talking about it more, by issuing this advisory, I not only want to put it on our radar as a country, as a public health issue of concern, but I want to pull back that curtain that has hidden loneliness for too long so we can see it and so we can ultimately address it. Because that's the good news. We actually can do something to address the loneliness crisis as we lay out in the advisory.
And I want to hear about that more. But before we tackle that, I know in a recent op-ed, you wrote about your own experience with loneliness that happened pre-pandemic. Why was it important for you to share that? And why were you feeling so isolated?
Well, Katie, I had made a common mistake that I suspect other people may have made, which is I got into a new job. I poured myself entirely into it, but told myself that, you know what, I'm too busy to keep up with my friends right now. I'll just catch up with them at some point later, right? And days and weeks and months went by, and I got deeper and deeper into work. My relationships frayed more and more. And I didn't realize the full impact that would have on me, but it turned out that it actually made it harder for me to do my work. I found that I was at greater risk of burnout because I didn't have the social support that I was used to having around me. But I also found that when that job ended and I was left without the meaning that I had from work and the community that I had at work, I was suddenly really quite alone in ways that hit me with full force. And that was really hard to deal with. I really struggled for a long time. And it was my wife, Alice, who finally told me, because she saw what was happening, she told me, she said, I think you're struggling with loneliness. I think you need to build a community again. And so it took a long year of struggle to figure out how to get my footing back. But I told that story because one, it felt cathartic to share it, but I also wanted others who maybe struggle with loneliness to know that they're not alone. A lot of us are going through a similar experience.
How has loneliness contributed to the polarization, the deep divide we're witnessing in this country?
Well, when we're separated from one another, when we don't know each other well, then it's easier to hate someone else. It's easier to think of them as the enemy or the opposition. There's an old saying that it's hard to hate somebody up close. And I think about that often because I think one consequence of us losing our relationships is that we are more prone to division and to polarization. And and that worries me because when I look at the big threats that our country is facing, whether it's the threat of violence or whether it's the threat of climate change or whether it's economic inequality, all of these challenges, they require us to be able to come together and to work together to address common threats. If we have another pandemic down the line, and we likely will at some point, we don't know when, but there will be another pandemic at some point. I want us to be unified and together and invested in one another so that we can respond with unity and force and ultimately get through it. All of that is at risk when we're disconnected from one another.
Gosh, that seems like a tall order. Having said that, Vivek, I know that you're not only issuing an advisory, but you're also issuing a framework to tackle this problem. Tell me what that advisory and framework will do.
Yes, so I'm a big fan of not only stating problems but stating solutions and being able to mobilize us to actually act. And that's what we do in this advisory. So in our framework for a national strategy to address loneliness and isolation, we have a number of pillars, six in fact, that we lay out that we can pursue to tackle loneliness. And this requires all of us. It's not just what government can do. It's not just what community organizations can do. It's also what individuals and families and workplaces and schools can all do, and faith organizations working together. And I'll share a couple of examples, from this. We know, for example, that in communities, the faith organizations have a very powerful role that they can play in bringing people together to learn about one another across differences. We know that recreational organizations and civic organizations can do the same, but participation in all of these groups has declined over the last several decades. And so we have to rebuild them. We know in schools as well, schools have a really powerful role to play in helping teach children about emotions and about how to build healthy relationships. Some of that happens through social and emotional learning curricula. But we have to make this a priority within our schools and support teachers as well, because they have so much on their plates now, but this is incredibly valuable for them. And think about government as well. We know that the layout of our cities impacts how easy it is for us to get together and see one another. But we also know for individuals, right, that there's a lot they can do. Simply taking 15 minutes a day to reach out to someone you care about, just to say, hey, I'm thinking of you. I want to see how you're doing. That can make a big difference. Making sure that when you are interacting with other people, that you're giving them your full attention, that you're putting devices aside and focusing on them, that can deepen the quality of interaction, the fulfillment that you get. And finally, just keep in mind that looking for ways in our individual lives to help others, to serve others, whether that's people in our workplace or in our neighborhood, that can also help us address loneliness, which people sometimes think is counterintuitive because, hey, if we're lonely, don't we need help? But it turns out that when we reach out and help somebody else, we forge a connection with them and we remind ourselves of all the value that we bring to the world. And that sometimes we can lose sight of the value that we bring to the world, our own self-worth, when we struggle with loneliness for a long time.
What other kind of measures are you recommending? I know that teenage girls, according to the CDC, are experiencing unprecedented levels of depression and anxiety. 30%, I believe, have contemplated suicide. 60% of teenage girls report feelings of pervasive sadness and hopelessness. How can we address this?
Yeah, so this is really alarming. And if you look at the trends, particularly around sadness and hopelessness, you see that those numbers among high school students have been increasing for years now. And in fact, if you look at the suicide rate, you see that there was a 57% increase in the suicide rate among young people in the decade prior to the pandemic. And we know that things worsened for many kids during the pandemic. So what can we do? Well, it turns out that to address the mental health crisis, rebuilding connection is absolutely essential because our connections with one another are the buffers that help reduce the impact of stressors in our life. And young people in the last few years have experienced a lot of stressors, disruption from the pandemic, gun violence in their communities. Gun violence has now become the #1 cause of death among young people in America. And they also worry a lot about climate change. They look at the polarization and division that exists in the country, and that sometimes makes them feel less confident that we're actually going to be able to create a better future than the past. So the relationships really do matter, but we've also got to make sure help is there for kids who are in crisis. It's one of the reasons that we work very hard to set up 988, which is the new crisis line, the mental health crisis line that anyone can call or text at any hour of the day if you or someone around you is experiencing a mental health crisis, and you'll be connected to a trained mental health counselor. But it's also important that we set up the services in communities, the mental health clinics, and strengthen the workforce. And we put billions of dollars in the last 2 years into doing just this, expanding the opportunities for people to get appointments and get care using technology to bring care to where people are. So the bottom line is we've got to work on multiple fronts to get care to where people are, but address the root causes of what's causing this crisis among young people. And it's one of the reasons I've been so focused on youth mental health during my tenure as Surgeon General, because what could be more important than making sure that our young people are healthy and well?
You mentioned connecting people through technology, but as you well know, technology is a big problem. We're all addicted to our phones. We are comparing our lives to manufactured images that are being projected to us 24/7. Teens are particularly susceptible to that, but I too am addicted to my phone and am on it constantly, almost without thinking. So how can we break this very deep relationship so many people have with their digital devices?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked, Katie, because look, I'm a believer in technology. I spent 7 years building a technology company. I use technology all the time. We use technology to get public health messages out to the public. But the problem with tech is it can help or hurt depending on how it's designed and how it's used. And I think for many of us in our lives, particularly for our kids, I think technology has in some cases had a harmful effect on them, stealing time away from sleep and other activities that are important for their development, but also in some cases also reducing the quality of their relationships with other people and reducing their own sense of self-esteem, which is what kids tell me all the time as they constantly compare themselves to other people online. So I do think that technology is a double-edged sword. And I think what we have to do as a society is we've got to make sure, as I've said in the past, that we have safety standards in place, for this technology that ensures that it helps and doesn't hurt our kids. We've got to actually enforce those safety standards. We also have to ensure that we are getting the data from social media companies about the impact on mental health so that independent scientists can assess who's most at risk and what interventions are working to mitigate or reduce that risk. And scientists right now say that they just do not have access to the data that they need. And so,
That's so true. I
and
was on
so
a commission to fight disinformation with the Aspen Institute. And you can't even address the problem because you don't know how serious it is, because for that very reason, scientists do not have any access to the social media tools that are being used or the information that's being gleaned by users.
Yeah, and this is why I think, Katie, that look, there's an important role for policymakers here when it comes to setting these safety standards and creating guardrails. But I think in our own lives, this is why it's important for us, I think, to have sacred spaces that we create without technology, so our brain can remember what it's like to live and interact with other people in person again. And while it's hard to do that alone, this is why doing it together with other people makes a big difference. So one thing that I did in my own life, Katie, is I made a commitment with a couple of my good friends, Sunny and Dave, that we would form a pact, called MOI, where we would be there for each other. But some of this involved how we dealt with technology. So we decided that whenever we did our 2-hour monthly video conference call, that we weren't going to check email. We weren't going to have our phones with us. We would do it on our computer, but we would focus. We also have helped each other make pacts to create other safe spaces in our life that are technology free. And we've kept each other accountable, which is really important because it's easy to fall off the wagon. And then when I first started doing that, I found that, what was happening to me, Katie, the same thing that was happening to you. My hand would sometimes reach out down into my pocket and I would mindlessly find a website that I was checking all the time or go to my inbox, even when I didn't really need anything. But then I remembered, hey, I made this commitment to Sunny and Dave that I'm going to keep this part of my life, tech free. Dinner time at the table, for example, was one of those. So it's not easy to do, but it's important that we do it because, again, there's no substitute for in-person interaction. And there's also no substitute for having peace and solitude and time where we can allow ourselves to reground, to settle and to just enjoy our time in nature or in quiet. And it's hard to do that sometimes when a device is constantly buzzing.
And even having a device on a table near you is a distraction. You have to have it actually in another room. I know studies have shown that. I've done a lot of research on this, Vivek, so I know a lot about this, but they also say that your best ideas come when you're not being distracted. So it's when you're taking a walk in nature, when you're taking a shower, when you're daydreaming, that actually fires off the part of your brain that's responsible for creativity. And if you're constantly, you're constantly distracted or you're constantly taking incoming information, it doesn't give your mind a chance to rest and create.
That is so true. And it's important because a lot of times we think, well, we're not really that distracted, or we can multitask, or we can listen to a phone call and check that message at the same time. But the science is very interesting and clear on this, which is that our brain actually doesn't multitask, it rapidly task switches. And so when we are listening to someone on the phone, if we're also checking our email, it turns out we're not listening in that moment. We may hear some sounds, but we're not fully processing what they're saying. And to really do deep work, we've got to concentrate, like you said. And it takes us actually looking at, depending on the studies you look at, it can take on over 20 minutes to actually restore your focus once you're distracted. So if you're trying to write a paper, or if you're trying to do some deep thinking, or if you're trying to figure out a strategy, for your kids' summer plans or whatever, that takes a level of focus that we are often not attaining because we're constantly distracted.
We're constantly being interrupted, and that process can't take hold because we have to start over again, and then you never get to that deep thinking level. I'm so glad you're issuing this information, you're making people aware of it, and that you're giving some ideas for how to cope with loneliness. But the cynical side of me, Vivek, cannot help but wonder if this will truly have any impact. And how are you going to shake people and make them aware that this is having, extremely dangerous health consequences, and that they need to change their lifestyle? Because that's such a difficult task.
It is a hard thing to do, but I'll tell you why I feel hopeful, Katie, because in all the time that I have served as Surgeon General over 2 stints, there's no issue that I have found has resonated more deeply with people than the issue of loneliness and social connection, because so many people are actually experiencing it right now. But the second thing that's really important is that when people hear about public health challenges, they normally figure these are so big, somebody else has to do something about them. There's nothing I can do. But we now know very clearly that the individual steps we take in our lives, whether it's the 15 minutes we spend, whether with somebody once a day, whether it's the focus that we bring without our devices to our conversations, however short they may be, whether it's a small acts of help and service we extend to others, or the smile that we offer to somebody in a line at the grocery store, we know that these make a material difference in how we feel. And so that means that we have agency. And that's a really important part. We can do something about this. We can impact loneliness in our lives. That now that we know, and my hope is through the advisory, more people will know that this is a common struggle. The goal is to be able to talk about it more. And if we can talk about it more, we can work together more. Because some of the community solutions that we need, having places where we can gather, organizing potlucks where we come together and support one another and getting to know each other, these are things where we have to work together. But when we make a commitment together, then we can create change. And that's what I'm asking people to do, is to recognize that this is one of the most important foundational issues we are dealing with in society today, our disconnection from one another.
Could you give us some simple measures that anybody could take that will have a positive impact on their lives and reduce loneliness?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'll just give you, I'll give you four. If you do this, this will help you feel less lonely. Every day, uh, spend 15 minutes reaching out to somebody you care about. It could be a text to a friend. It could be a call to your mother, 15 minutes. Number two, when you are spending time with someone else, having dinner with them, having breakfast, talking to them on the phone, don't check your devices for in terms of your inbox or checking the news or looking things up. Just allow yourself to focus entirely on them. You will feel jittery initially, but you will feel better at the end of that. The third thing is extend kindness to people around you, right? That could be somebody next to you in the line at the grocery store. It could be a neighbor that you pass by when you're walking in your neighborhood. Smile at them, ask them how they're doing. And you'll find that even that brief moment of interaction in your neighborhood or in an elevator will make you feel better. And
I
finally,
do that all the time, and I think people in New York think I'm crazy.
well, so I'm glad you said that, because sometimes when we think about reaching out to people, we think, well, people are going to think I'm odd or that I'm like,
I say hi to everyone, Vivek.
yeah, well, that's one of the reasons people love you so much, Katie. But I'll tell you that a lot of times those people you're saying hi to, they are often experiencing some degree of loneliness themselves, and they may be stunned in the moment because it's so unusual. But I guarantee you that many of those people actually feel better when they leave that. In fact, we know that. We know that when people receive smiles from folks that they're passing on the street, they actually do feel better, even if it doesn't register with you as the person doing the smiling. So these
Well,
are small.
before you get to four,
Yeah.
doesn't the smiler benefit
Yes.
chemically from smiling? So it's not just the recipient, it's the person who's doing the smiling. Haven't studies shown that as well?
Yes, yes, both people benefit. And you know why that is? It's because this is how we were designed over thousands of years. It was to connect with one another. It was to extend, kindness to one another, to experience these moments of warmth with one another, because that's how we build trust. And when we build trust, we were more likely to survive in those days when we were hunters and gatherers. So, a lot has changed in our life, but our bodies and our nervous systems are still very similar to how they were thousands of years ago. We still respond to those similar cues. And the fourth
Tell
and
us number four.
yeah, the fourth one I'll leave you with is acts of service. So finding small ways to help people in your life, people at work, people in your neighborhood, people in your family, strangers who you encounter, that goes a long way to helping. And here's why: because when you help somebody else, you forge a connection with them that feels very meaningful, but you also remind yourself that you have value to bring to the world. And this is critical because a lot of times, Katie, when we struggle with loneliness, it can chip away over time at our sense of self-worth, our self-esteem. And we start to believe that we're lonely because we're not likable or because we're not lovable. And when you help somebody else in that moment, you break that cycle of loneliness and you help remind yourself that no, you do have value to bring to the world. These are small steps that can just take seconds or minutes in your day, these four that I mentioned, but they can go a long way toward helping you feel more connected to other people.
Well, I hope people follow your recommendations. Dr. Vivek Murthy, Surgeon General of the United States, always so wonderful to see you. And I'm going to start practice, even though I do a lot of those, I need to get rid of my phone more. And it's so insulting, by the way, when you're with people and you're not giving them your undivided attention. People feel diminished. It's the opposite of forming a connection. It's like breaking a connection. So I'm going to practice that. I'm going to also try to do more things for other people, even though I do try to do that on a pretty regular basis. And I'm already smiling at everyone and talking to everyone. So I think I've got that one covered.
That is great. Well, you're a great role model in that regard, Katie. But look, this is something we've got to help each other do, because it's hard to stay on the track, with these things all the time. But when when you make a pact with a friend that, hey, we're gonna change our behavior in this way and we're gonna do it together, it makes it a lot easier to sustain. So I'm so glad that you have been interested in this issue for a long time. I do think it's one of the most critical public health issues we're facing, and it's beyond public health. It affects the foundation of our society, our ability. We know that, again, it's not just about individual health, but communities that are more connected experience less violence, more economically prosperous, and they benefit in many other ways. So for so many reasons, focusing on connection is what we need to do right now.